So just to let you know, today we'd hoped to have Lou Smith with us today, who is, she calls herself a specialist non-specialist, I think is a great term. She's a primary school teacher who had a specialism in science and then converted or had to teach English, had to teach languages, and actually became really passionate about teaching languages. Unfortunately, she's not able to make it today, but we've put her Twitter handle up there so that you can follow her. She's got loads of great advice, and she said she's absolutely happy to talk to anyone if anyone has questions, just to show you that it's not just us strange aliens who speak languages. It is something that lots of people can do really successfully, teaching languages, even if they're not a specialist in them, and it's something that is for everybody. It's not something you have to be particularly skilled in one area to be able to do. But today, talking to you, it'll be so I'm Zoe from Language Nut. I'm the head of content there and former teacher, and my colleague Elaine, who is also a former very experienced teacher, and has, as you can see from the bios, has got a wealth of experience. So we'll be talking to you today about all the tips and tricks we've learnt over the years. So what we'll be covering, the main areas are how to find and then use the resources for teaching MFL. So obviously you are trained teachers, you know what you're doing, but teaching MFL, there might be different tactics to how you introduce new information, new vocab, new structures and so on. How you can make sure you bring native speech into the classroom, how you can improve your own subject knowledge. So how do you learn as you go? How do you try and learn a language when you're basically 1 week ahead of the kids? And also, how do you deal with any difficult questions? So I'm going to start with my colleague Elaine is going to talk about finding MFL resources.
Thank you, Zoe. Good afternoon, everybody. And as Zoe says, I've got quite a lot of experience, well, 33 years nearly of teaching, and I've been in a situation working in secondary and primary where actually you're in a situation where you are just a little bit ahead of the students and of your pupils in your class. From my experience, I was teaching in a primary school because we were overstaffed in the secondary school, and we just wanted to reach out to a few of our primaries that sent children to us to give the children an experience really from not a native speaker, but a trained MFL teacher. So I ended up going into several primary schools, a couple of which they asked for Spanish, and Spanish being a trained German, French, English native speaker, but also being a trained German and French teacher, Spanish was kind of my third language to teach. So I found myself in a situation where it was a sweating job when I went in there. I was almost like panicking. So I can understand where people are coming from if you have little or no knowledge of a language, because one of the things that frustrates, I think, all of us as linguists is if you are told, well, you're a language teacher, so you should be able to teach whatever, any language. Well, in actual fact, all languages are very different. So it is, each language brings its own challenges. And so before I start on this finding MFL resources, really, I just want to share a few other bits and pieces with you that if you are a secondary teacher, you may well find that, you going into a school and an MFL teacher has resigned at the last minute or has become ill, and you may be asked to teach a subject which you have little knowledge of. If you, for example, you teach a couple of languages at your school and the French teacher goes off and you're a Spanish teacher, or vice versa, or even German. So that can be an issue that you're faced with, and it does happen because I've experienced that myself in departments that I've led and also in schools where I've been working. Or it could be that you've had an Ofsted visit and your MFL delivery is not up to what they're expecting for MFL, because as we all know, in England, for example, it's the aspiration of the government that we will be teaching a lot more students how to speak a language in the next few years. Or you could be in a primary school where you're not doing enough for MFL, as I've often worked alongside primary colleagues and they've asked me, what do we do to ensure that we're teaching what we should be teaching at Key Stage 2 and to sort of support that. So as Zoe said, you are a teacher. You're a teacher of children, regardless of the subject or the content that you're teaching and delivering. So always bear that in mind, that whatever you are a teacher, and therefore you are you have all the tools in your kit. Whatever those tools are, they might be slightly different. And I know Lou, when we were talking to Lou earlier this week, looking at this training session, she's a science teacher, so she has a wealth of experience in supporting people. And as Zoe said, we can't sort of stress enough how, if you do feel you want to reach out to Lou, she's more than happy to give you support and help there. And it could well be that we know in the next sort of, when things are back to normal with all the issues we're all facing at the moment, we actually get Lou in and do another session with her because she's unable to attend today. But I think it's important that you build that working relationship with your students and create that classroom climate where the students feel valued and that they feel comfortable to make mistakes, just as you are comfortable to make mistakes. And obviously making use of any of the technology that's available to you and the personalised feedback. And have some confidence in yourself. Think about what you already know and what your gaps are, just like you would a child that you're teaching. And because more knowledge will bring more confidence. The more confident you become, the more knowledge you have, the more times you practice it before you actually teach it, the more confident you'll become. And I think it's important to have a realistic, sensible long-term plan for what you want to achieve and by when. So it will help you focus and stay on target. But if you don't have that and you don't stay on target with what you're wanting to deliver, it doesn't really matter, because the experience that you have in the classroom with the children is the most important thing. And it's about teaching them a couple of words, 3 or 4 words, not being over ambitious, because if they can get those words correct, they will feel a sense of confidence themselves and you'll see them flourish as time goes on. As Zoe mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you stay one step ahead of them. If you can stay a week ahead in your planning, I know it's a lot to ask, but if you can manage that, you will find that you will feel more confident with it, because if you know that what's coming next week and you've already planned it and practiced it, it'll stop that sweaty feeling and that sort of stressy feeling, which I think we do get as linguists, because we have to perform in the classroom much more than you do for other subjects. And if you can make use of a lot of low stakes quizzes so that you can see where the gaps are, there's no real threat if students make mistakes, because it doesn't really, well, in primary school, does it really count? Well, yes, it does, obviously, but there is no kind of like exam that they have to do at the end of Key Stage 2. And if you're teaching Key Stage 3, then yes, it's less threatening than if you're teaching Key Stage 4, because it's very, very unusual for a teacher who hasn't got a significant qualification in their language to be asked to teach GCSE. And if you are, then you really do need to be digging your heels in and saying, well, actually, if you want the results that I'm expecting you're wanting, then it's about time you sort of looked at the training that I've been given, and also is it really feasible to ask me to do that? That might be a difficult conversation to have, but it's worth bearing that in mind, and hopefully nobody will ever come across that situation. I think it's really important to share any concerns that you have if you feel out of depth, because a new subject does bring extra workload, and don't suffer in silence. Reach out to anybody you can find, and I think linguists are the biggest sharers in all of the subjects that are taught, and I think that's because we are expected to perform on so many different levels in a foreign language in such a limited length of time that you have the contact time you have with your students in primary and in secondary. So don't suffer in silence. You'll find there's so much out there to help you. And one more thing that I want to mention before we get on to the meat of that slide that's showing is really getting comfortable being uncomfortable. That's my mantra. About 18 months ago, I gave up drinking completely because it wasn't good for me. I was finding that I was maybe not performing as well as I could, and so I got comfortable being uncomfortable. And because teaching out of your area is very difficult, and you should celebrate that. You should feel good and really proud of what you achieve if you manage to get some students in your care to actually speak in a different language, because that is a skill for life. It's not just about passing an exam. So I'll move on to the finding MFL resources now. I think working with other teachers in the same situation as you is really crucial. If you can plan together, if you can get into a local primary, another local primary school in your area, in your hub, in your LEA that's maybe delivering a language, because together you can share the workload and you can share resources, and planning is really vital for teaching, as we all know. If you're in primary, then obviously, and if you're joining us from Scotland today, you'll know about the 1+2 initiative. And if you're not in Scotland, I would urge you to have a look at the resources that they use in Scotland. They're absolutely great. They have a fantastic scheme of work up there that's been put together, where they're delivering the language through other subjects. So, for example, just examples of doing PE in a different language, or doing a topic like the Normans, for example, and using sort of another language to do that. Just the key vocabulary that you might do, and you even set up a scenario of that in terms of that. I remember doing a project with the French during the First World War, and we set up a trench in the school, and we actually did all the words for the items in the trench, and we wrote some little poems that we could link to that when I was working with one primary school. Doing maths in another subject, again, there's lots of things there, but the 1+2 initiative in Scotland is a good way to find resources. There are lots of online free resources, as we know, and lots that you can pay for. Social media sites like, for example, Lightbulb Languages, which again is great to tap into. Those of you that have come across 1/3 Stories is a good where sort of a third of the sentence is in the language and you gradually build up to the main whole sentence or the main paragraph. The Primary French project, which again runs through the ALL, and if you're not a member of the ALL, the Association for Languages Learning, I suggest you kind of look at their website and see whether you feel you could benefit from being a member, because they have some amazing stuff on their site, which is free. Also, a couple of websites there, the Culture Tech one that I've put a screenshot of, and the Bonhomme de Chemin de FR, and obviously we can't forget BBC Primary Languages, which again is really good for resources. The Facebook groups, the one that I know Lou, if she'd have been joining us today, raves about is LIPS, Languages in Primary Schools, and if you have a look on there, you can become a member. I've just been speaking to somebody on there today actually about some training that they are running through their university for their ITT students, and I think it's a great place to find resources. Claire Seckham is another really good advocate for primary, and some of her, well, all of her resources are outstanding. And then obviously the apps that you can get, you've got Duolingo and Quizlet, which if you're a little bit more confident, you can find resources on there. Obviously Language Nut, which as you know, we both, Zoe and I, work for Language Nut, but it's just one of the offers there. And then language organisers. Okay, is there anything else? I'm sure Zoe will add to that when I pass over to her now, because I think Zoe is doing the next slide. Okay, thank you, Zoe.
Thanks very much, Elena. That's great. So I can see from what everybody's been saying today that in the Q&A and so on, saying hello, which is really great. I can see we've got quite a mix with us today. We've got quite a few people who are in primary schools, teachers and TAs, which is fantastic to have you here, who are being asked to teach languages without potentially being that confident in the language. We also have some secondary teachers who are teaching languages that they are not as confident in. I know it's really common. I've been in the similar situation, and so is Elaine, where, you know, if you're a German specialist and being asked to teach Spanish, as that's obviously changing in schools a lot more. So hello to you as well. Some of what we're talking about today will be more suited to one particular group than others, but we're going to try to make it fair as we can across the whole webinar. So this section, I'm going to be talking about how do you actually use these resources, how do you teach languages. So this is perhaps more for the primary teachers and TAs today, because if you teach another language, then you presumably already have a lot of these sort of tips and tricks and different activities up your sleeve already. Although you never know, there might be some things that you are reminded of or you haven't come across before. But later on, we will be talking about upskilling yourself and improving your subject knowledge in that area. So hopefully that will be more suitable for the secondary as well. So talking about how do you use these resources, as Elaine mentioned, there are loads and loads of resources out there. But when it comes to it, you're right, you know what you have to teach and how do you deliver them. And I think a really good starting point is actually phonics. And if you are in primary, then that will presumably be a big part of your teaching anyway. You're used to teaching phonics through English. And if you're teaching French, German, or Spanish, for example, phonics is actually even better with those because they are much more phonetic languages that have far more consistent rules than English does. So I know that's a real problem when you're teaching phonics with English, where you have a billion different ways that the same group of letters could be pronounced, whereas with French, German, and Spanish, to a greater or lesser extent, you can learn particular rules and then you will always know how to pronounce something. And I put a couple of nonsense words on there, which if you do speak French or German, you will know these are not real words, they're completely made up. But if you learn the phonic rules and the phonetic rules of French and German, you will know without ever having heard it that these are pronounced Trèvroigny and Juvenheimer. And you can know by learning those rules, that's how they're pronounced. And if you start with that, which is linked to the way you teach English, so it is hopefully familiar for you and for the students, that gives you a really, really strong basis for moving forward when you do learn new words. So I think that that is a really, really good, strong place to start. And NSALT and Sue Cave have loads of really, really good resources that you can use online for getting your phonics there, because there will be obviously some that are different. And I think it could be really interesting for your students to look at how are different letters and letter combinations pronounced in different languages. So a J would be a J sound most of the time in English, but in German it will be a Y sound, in French it will be a J sound, and that can be really interesting for the students to look at that and kind of use their language detective skills a bit. Another good starting point is looking at the phrases that you're going to be using regularly, so your classroom phrases. And there are loads and loads of lists of these around that you can find in different schemes of work and online. But if you get really comfortable with those, first of all, and try to embed them into your lessons. You could do the register in French, German or Spanish, for example, and get the students to say, présent or whatever, and get used to them, learning how to be quiet, put their hand up, and all the different kind of things, the classroom phrases in those languages. So your phonics and your classroom phrases are a really, really good place to start. Then we look into how do you introduce new vocab and chunks. And again, apologies for the secondary teachers who know a lot of this already. More and more people are looking at introducing not just single words, but actually sort of short phrases that you can put together. So making sure you introduce those as well. And it's a little bit different to how you might introduce other subjects, because for example, when you're teaching maths, you don't usually have to present all the numbers and get the students to chant them back to you and so on. It's how do you introduce words or short phrases that the students kind of need to memorize and to get to the point where it's of automation so that they can produce it spontaneously. Got a few different techniques here. So first of all, you could do call repetition. So you could be using your flashcards, for example, or real items that you're putting up. You could have it up on the screen, whichever. Language that has a learn screen where you can introduce those with the audios as well with native speakers. Get the students to repeat it back, get them to repeat it in different ways, quietly, loudly, just all boys or girls or different tables or groups or whatever. And you can do a kind of Mexican wave around the classroom of chanting it round. So getting them to really practice that so they really tune into that. Again, the phonics are really useful for that as well. And then for drilling, one game which my students really used to love was Beat the Teacher. So if you've got all your flashcards up on the screen on your interactive whiteboard, for example, or you've got them up stuck to your whiteboard if it's a bit more low-tech classroom, you point to one of them and you say the word, and if it's correct, the students chant it back at you, and you keep pointing to them, and then sometimes you make a mistake deliberately and you point to one, it's the wrong one, and at that point the class should stay quiet. I used to have the rule that if it was more than one or two students, then I got the point, and if they were correct, if they were quiet when they should be, then they got the point. That stops the one child who gets it wrong being blamed from the whole class. So do it safe, if it's more than one or two. And they really like that because they want to be the teacher, they want to be kind of competitive. It's a little bit like Simon Says, but with that. Another game with your flashcards is you can have them all up, and I used to have two fly swatters, So obviously this is back when you can move around the classroom a bit more. You have 2 students come to the front with the fly swatters, clean ones obviously. I'd say a word, and the first one to hit the correct one on the board gets a point for their team. And then I used to say is a best of 3 and then swap around again. So that can be nice, and also students can do that themselves in groups as well when they're a bit more confident. The main aim of this is to get them to repeat it, to repeat as much as you can. So yeah, really get the pronunciation embedded in, and to have those links as much as possible. Another way that you can do this is, if less of a sort of presenting method, is to try to do a bit more of a kind of discovery method, so eliciting it from the students. So this works really well for lists of vocabulary which have links to the English. So for example, it could be fruits and vegetables, could be sports, these kind of things. And if you have a list of the French, German, Spanish, or whatever, the target language, and the English on the other side, getting the students to look at them and see if they can match them up. So that really helps them to look out for cognates, so words that are the same or very similar in their mother tongue. Any prior knowledge, any kind of link. So Elaine mentioned before, you know, if you're doing about the Normans, there are loads and loads of words in English that have French background, and often there are 2 sets of words for many things. So you have build, which is from Old English, and then construct, which is from the Latin and French construire. So you can use those, you know, those kind of ways to help them elicit that, and yeah, kind of look at the pattern spotting, which is really, really important as a skill for language. The next thing I'm talking about is retrieval practice. So it's a lot of research has shown that if you just hear something and repeat it sort of fairly passively, that can be quite good for your short-term memory, but it doesn't get into your long-term memory. Which, in the way to get into your long-term memory is to actually practice what they call retrieving it. So actually kind of small low stakes quizzes, as Ole mentioned, so that they can actually practice retrieving it from that part of their brain that makes it go into the long-term memory. And it's really useful to try to do this with different skills. So not just listening, not just reading, writing, speaking, trying to get a mix of them. Language Nut is one resource you can use for that. So for all our vocabulary games, we have all the different skills. They can practice them in different ways. So that helps them to be exposed to it in lots of different ways, to have that repetition. It's all automatically marked, so you don't have to mark it, which is useful. But there are lots of different resources you can use and different games and things you can play. There's a wealth of ideas on the social media sites. And as Elaine mentioned, I think the language teaching community is very, very generous at giving ideas. Something which is really nice is trying to vary the way in which you present things. So you can do a certain amount of what they call dual coding. So you could have actions that go with things, or sound or pictures and so on. So not just the word, but also some kind of different stimulus that goes with it. Actions can be really useful to go with sounds as well, for example. Sometimes it can be a nice way to use it if anyone knows any sort of Makaton signing, whatever, you can use those to kind of help just as a kind of memory aid for students. And also think about, do you want to use flashcards? Are they physical ones? Are they ones on a screen? Can you use real objects? What I used to do for teaching clothes was to bring them in. And I actually last year taught English in a cafe for refugees, and for the teaching clothes I brought in all my baby daughter's clothes. You know, we had the little socks and the jumpers and the trousers and so on, and they really liked that, to have something physical to be associated with it. Puppets can be another one, for really useful for primary, I would say, and you will often get students who are more comfortable talking to a puppet if you're doing a kind of role play or whatever, or talking through the puppet. You know, they might be a bit shy about talking in front of the class, but having a puppet can be really useful. There are lots of photos here which are actually from Elaine, things that she's used. So using, you know, making masks with vocabulary on the back, using these balancing clowns and butterflies, which have a sort of 5p coin on them, so they can balance. There's a little bit of science project as well, and again with vocabulary on them. Making a clock, all kinds of things. There are yeah, lots of really physical things you can do. And this is a really good chance to explore creative opportunities. So singing, drama, poetry, and so on. Songs, I think, are really particularly useful. I still remember songs that I learnt when I was first learning languages. I can still sing the German prepositions for accusative and dative to different tunes, and I still go through that when I'm trying to remember things. There are loads of resources out there. Language Note has some songs and stories in the primary account, but also really good resources are Alain Lelay. I can put that in the chat so you can see that. He has loads of YouTube videos with really catchy songs, and that works for secondary as well. My Key Stage 3, they always love those. And also Marie-Odile Guyot on the Languages in Primary Schools Facebook group. Writes amazing poetry. It's authentic poems which have a real phonics focus as well, so they practice using different sounds, and they're really, really useful. So lots of things that you can do. Bring that in the same way that you would teach your other subjects as well. And I'm going to hand over to Elaine.
You can stay on that slide, Zoe, for a minute.
Sure.
Yeah, I've just put in the chat. I don't know if you can see Sarah there, SARA''. Can you see that, Zoe, in the chat? Can you see that? Yeah, that's a very good website. A lady who actually she takes covers of any song that you can think of in English, any of the pop songs, and she sings them in French, and they're absolutely great. Students love them. I was listening to one yesterday. If you know Sia, the lady that wears a mask and over her head, she's Australian, and she was singing Chandelier in French. It was really nice to see. But yeah, just going back to there, they are some of the things that I've done. I've taught in some very challenging inner city schools in the north of England. And when I say challenging, I mean really challenging. Some very low ability students. So I understand what it's like to teach a little bit rather than a lot. So, and Zoe mentioned there some of the things. The balancing clowns and butterflies there are a really good cross link for science. You can actually see the centric. My husband's a scientist. He gave me the idea years ago, and the idea with that is you can design with a template that if you want the template, I can send you the template, and you can write your French or Spanish or German or Mandarin, whatever you want, on the back, and the students can see them. If you can look to the right of we had a student there who was very good at art and just did that as something that helped her to learn the parts of the face. You can see to the right of that is a little circle. That's actually a concert band which you can buy very cheaply, and the students there, they can write words on there that they can remember. Even if you only teach 2, you can put the words on there. It just helps, and they quite like that, to just wear that for the day or maybe for a week. And the t-shirts there, love that. You can build that up over time. Little phrases, little dialogues. You could get all sorts going on. That was a shopping dialogue. You teach, you know, maybe one sentence, and it takes you a couple of weeks. You add to that and you build up. So it's kind of like, that's your end goal. Your end goal is a t-shirt. Okay, and they can add to that. And as Zoe mentioned, the masks there, the kids who are very, very low self-esteem can teach from behind a mask, as can a teacher, as we all know in these COVID situations. And then the other one is just a really long sheet of well, it's backing paper, or you can buy it from many shops. I won't advertise where I got that from, but it's a big Swedish company. You can just roll it out. The children can draw on it. They can, like one of my students laid on it, and we drew around the body, and they labelled it. But I remember, you know, plasticine, again, as Zoe said, when you can get back to the classroom, if the children have got their own set of plasticine they can use, it's their own in a little box, they can make all sorts of things and make letters out of it, or you call out a word and they have to design the thing. It's just a little bit of cross-curricular. And one of the things I did in lockdown was I got my students, I said to them, right, we're having an hour off learning. I want you to go out and I want you to conjugate the verb avoir, or the verb haben, or tener, or whatever, and use leaves to do it, or stones to do it. And they had then took some pictures and sent them to me so I could see it, and they absolutely loved that. And when we had the snow, they did that as well. It's just a little bit different. Some of the students only managed to do the I form or the he or she, but it doesn't matter because they're actually engaging with the learning. And I think one of the most successful lessons I ever had, or half terms work I ever had with a year 5 class, was they were doing some sewing, and they had a craft club after school, and they all made an animal. stuffed animal, and they wrote some words on the outside, and they sewed the words on, and it was absolutely amazing. Things like that. Zoe mentioned about clothes. I was smiling there. I remember one day I actually borrowed some loads of clothes from people. I just dressed up and I went to the classroom. Probably couldn't get away with this now, but I just kept taking clothes off, going, I'm wearing a jacket, I'm wearing a jumper, I'm wearing a shirt. And the kids absolutely loved it. I thought, what's going on? This woman's absolutely crazy. But you know what? The kids loved it because they found it amazing. And you could even get them to sort of just something a little bit different, even get them to bring an item of clothing in and they wear that, and they have to identify who is that item of clothing, who's wearing it, and that way they're learning sort of items of clothing in a fun way. But I think one of the most, I said one of the best lessons, but one of the most learning lessons for me was when I took a bag of fruit and vegetables into the classroom, proper ones, and some of the children in my class had never seen a banana. And this was going back to the early noughties, about 2002, and it took my breath away, did that, because then it was then that I thought, you know, nothing surprises me in this life. But the children actually then, and then I cut it up and they all tasted it, and it's like, I prefer banana, I like bananas, and you can just do all sorts of things with that, all sorts of things. Okay, right, Zoe, if you could move on. Sorry, that's me reminiscing. So bringing native speech into the classroom is quite tricky, I think, because obviously you're going to have to try and use a native speaker audio, which you can get from online dictionaries, from YouTube, and as Zoe said, Language Note, we have lots of, all of our resources are done using native speakers, but again, there's lots more out there for you to use. And you could even ask, you know, some of the GCSE students that in a secondary school, or some of the A-level students, if you wanted to try and practice, they could actually make you some listening material if they've got a good accent, but the teachers as well. Or if there's a foreign language assistant, as I mentioned a little bit earlier on in this list, if there's a foreign language assistant there, you could maybe ask them to do you make some little short recordings that you can use, then you can keep them and just keep using them on and on again. If any of your staff in the school speak another language and they are from the native country or from an area where that's spoken, use them and tap into them if you can. Or you might have parents or relatives. If you send out a questionnaire, or maybe you can access that from your school's database. And I know with GDPR you're not allowed to do that, but there's nothing, you can't actually speak to them directly. But if you're in a school and you know you've got a parent who's fluent in French or Spanish or German or whatever, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to come in and support you with that. Even you might have a little bit of funding to pay them, or even a bottle of wine or some flowers or some chocolates, whatever. It really goes down well. We've talked about using songs and third stories, one-third stories again, and I've explained about the FLA. And the British Council is another wealth of resources. They have something at the moment which I think is going to carry on because of the Brexit and the issues around employing an assistant, although you can now get an assistant for a short length of time. I think you can even apply for one for a few weeks now if you can host them in your school, and some of them would come free. When I was teaching in the 90s, we used to regularly have every year a student from a university in Dortmund, and they would come for 3 weeks, some would come for 6 weeks, and they would be part of our school. But the British Council do Connecting Classrooms through Global Learning, and if you've been on any of the websites, you will see that you can actually go into a classroom, not go in, but actually physically be in the classroom with another class in another country and have that just sort of virtual exchange of language, really. Okay, so those are just a few ideas. I'm sure Zoe's got loads more to mention, but I just wanted to sort of go through the ones on that sheet. I'll pass you back to Zoe now.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's really great to have native speech in your lessons if you can, and particularly if you're not feeling so confident about your accent, because obviously it's really useful for the students to see you saying the words, and you will need to. But if it's possible for you to play audios, in the games that you're doing, for example, if you're doing sort of call repetition, well, they could do it from an audio that you're playing through, for example, or an FLA or so on, as they mentioned. So the next thing I want to look at is learning as you go, and hopefully this is particularly relevant for both primary and secondary teachers and TAs. So I think there are three main places that you need to start. One of them is the scheme of learning or the scheme of work. So what is it that you need to cover? And as Elaine mentioned before, make sure you've tried to keep at least a week ahead so that you know what's coming and what you need to look at. That's going to be one area, what kind of topics. The next one is classroom language. So those kind of phrases, please repeat, put your hand up, write this down, and so on, those kind of phrases, get those in. And that's a really easy way to get in as much target language in your teaching as possible. And then the third place is high frequency language. So this is your key verbs, to be, to have, to go, to do, to put, to write, all those kind of things that come up again and again. Classic adjectives, these kind of, and connectives is another one. So have a look at those. Those are the areas that you really want to focus on. If you can conjugate the main verbs, do some connectives and so on, then it's easier to slot the extra vocab in afterwards and to look those up. But you really need those foundations of that kind of high frequency language. And if you focus on the top 100 or 200 words and chunks, and the sort of the topics that you'll need for this week's scheme of work, what you're meant to be covering, then that's actually very doable. Because you don't have to learn the whole of Spanish, you don't have to learn the whole language, you could learn these particular areas. And I think it's really important to focus on getting the key sounds right. So for example, the R sound in French and German, or R in Spanish, small things like that make a massive difference to the way you come across and the general quality of your speech. I know people who speak really, really great French or German, for example, but if they say ich instead of ich, or they say rarement instead of rarement, it makes them sound much worse than they are. And then the converse is true. So that can give you a boost of confidence. It's also really useful for your students as well. So again, it comes back to those phonics of getting those sounds. So if nothing else, if you can learn how to do a r sound, or a r, where depending on what language you're teaching, and for example an u sound, which comes up in both French and German, if you can do some of those key sounds that are particular to those languages, that will really stand you in good stead. And again, with that, as I mentioned before, with the phonics of working out what the language rules are of a particular language, so that, for example, in German, that a W is pronounced V, for example, those kind of things really help you. There are loads and loads of resources that you can look for upskilling yourself, for practicing. So the Association for Language Learning have loads and loads of resources for teachers who need to learn languages in order to teach. There are these TELT courses via the Open University, that's more aimed at primary school teachers. There are also, for secondary, you have these subject knowledge enhancement courses, some of which are residential or based in a university. Obviously the situation that will depend on the pandemic, but they're really useful to look at. Future Learn's online, so there are loads of courses there. And then other things that you can do is you can observe other colleagues, for example. You could maybe do a little bit of team teaching if that's suitable for you. Yeah, and work with other people to help with that. Elaine, is there anything you wanted to add on to that?
No, I think we've more or less covered everything there. There's lots of things that you can do, obviously, as Zoe's mentioned there, and they're just a few really. Great.
Well, then I'll leave you to talk about the difficult questions.
Thank you. So sometimes in primary, you might find, well, somebody might say to you, a parent or someone, well, what qualification have you got to be able to teach this language? And I think it's important at primary, you can probably get away with admitting to the students in your class that you don't have all the answers, but you can model how to find out the answer. So you can model looking up in a dictionary, you can model finding it online, you can model lots of different ways. At primary, you probably get away with that. At secondary, you might find that they're a little bit more savvy and a little bit more upfront and say, well, actually, if you're not a proper teacher, why are you teaching this? And this is my northern accent coming out now. As you notice, I'm from up in Leeds. That's where I am at the moment, in the north. But that's the kind of thing I've experienced. And that can sometimes really sort of kind of ruffle you. It can also set you off, it can really put you on the back foot. So it's a case of, well, how comfortable do you feel with the students that you're teaching? Is it a class that maybe you get on really well with? Is it a small class that you're nurturing? Which often you find that if you are teaching a language, you may well be given the classes that are not as should we say, are not as savvy at learning languages or not as forward, and therefore you end up thinking, well, how am I going to explain to them that I am actually one step ahead of them? Well, you could ask them to look it up, as Zoe's mentioned before. They don't have to know that you know that you don't know the answer, and that gives them ownership of their learning. And in some schools, that actually might be considered to be a reward. It could be something towards. I know some schools use, well, what initiative have you used in the classroom? What are you doing? You could actually, give that as a shout out on the school's big screens. Or I know it's all over at the moment on Twitter. A lot of schools are putting Learner of the Week, or Fantastic Friday, or whatever. Just something like that. Just gives the students a little bit more ownership, and makes them feel a little bit more, well, I can do this kind of thing. And students do love it when you say we're all still learning, and I learn something new every day, and so do I. After 33 years in teaching, I still learn something new every day. So let's enjoy this together. And you can almost treat it like a research project, a joint research. Let's have a look at the words for clothes. Let's look at the words, what do you wear on a Friday? Well, on a Saturday when you go out, well, I wear braces and I wear a top hat. Well, if you don't know that, then let's look it up together. And I think it's really important to talk to teachers who can speak other languages as well, because they'll be able to sort of say to you, I've come across this. What would you do? What have you done? And that's where the power of social media, which is amazing, really, wasn't around when I was training. We all had to find stuff out for ourselves, things like, going back to the 60s, some of the main ideas there are still prevalent today. I remember when I was being taught in the 70s. So a lot of what goes around comes around. And so you'll find that whatever people call it now has already been called something else. So if you say, well, always speak to teachers who can speak other languages, speak to people who've been in the profession for a long time as well, and they will give you lots of answers, but they'll all be very similar to what you come across these days. Okay, so that's, if you've got any other questions that you might think might pose a difficulty for you, then please put them in the chat, because we're more than happy to have a look at them today in the session, seeing as we've still got some time left. Okay, Zoe, I'll hand back to you then on the next slide.
Great, thanks very much. Just actually to add on to that, for the secondary one, but asking them to look it up. This could work for primary as well. It depends how comfortable, whether you feel comfortable letting the students know that you don't know the answer. It might depend on the vocabulary as well, how kind of unusual it is, whether you think you might be expected to know this. But one thing I sometimes used to do was, if a student asked me a word and I couldn't think of it in that moment, I would say, right, I'm going to tell you in 30 seconds. And if you can look it up and tell me what it is before I tell you in 30 seconds, you get a house point. And that just gave me just an amount of time to think, oh, what is that word again? Sometimes, particularly if you're a secondary school teacher teaching a different language to your specialist language, because, it's typical when you're trying to teach German, the French will be in your head and only that word and so on, so that can give you a bit of time. Or if you actually genuinely don't know the word and you don't want to admit it, then it could be, I'm just going to go put my, do the register or something. And which time you actually secretly look in the computer what the word is. And again, if you can tell me before I've finished doing the register or whatever, then you get a house one or something like that. So just sometimes if you have got a kind of class where you feel like you don't want to lose face, that can be a useful little thing. So yeah, we're coming to the end of the webinar now, and I hope that that's given you some useful ideas, practical tips. We want to make these as practical as possible, things that you can use. These are our emails, so Zoe and Elaine at languagenut.com, and we also have our colleague Dan, who looks after giving demos and things to teachers and looks after the account. So if you are interested in using LanguageNut, getting a free trial, for example, you'd be welcome to contact him. And please feel free to contact us if you have any questions, any more information. There's also Lou's Twitter handle, which we put at the beginning, is at Lou Lord Smith, which you can use. And we would just like to say, hang in there, you can do this. Particularly if you are a primary school teacher, you have had to learn so many things which are outside what you did your degree in, probably. So treat it as another thing like that. There are different ways in which you teach and introduce vocabulary, for example. It might be a little different, but you can do this. You are a teacher. You can use those kind of same pedagogical principles that you use for your other teaching. It can be done. And it's not that there are some kind of people who can learn languages and other people who can't. It is something, it's a very human thing. There are people in many, many countries across the world where they may not have high education levels, but they can speak 4 languages. You know, so it's not about education, it's not about intelligence, it's something which humans are hardwired to do. You can do this. If you have any questions, please add them in, otherwise we'll leave you there. And we'd love it if you have any feedback for us. Again, either put it in the chat or you can email us. And if you found this session useful, please do let your colleagues know on social media, and have a look at the other webinars that are coming up soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you.